Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to show you how to take cuttings of your Kalanchoe, or otherwise known as a Flaming Katy. So this is one of my plants. It's looking a little bit strange at the moment because I had it in a shady location and it started growing all these long thin shoots with small leaves. So I do actually need to prune it anyway. And when it comes to taking cuttings from a Kalanchoe, if you need to prune your plant anyway, then it's a perfect time to take the cuttings because then you're not wasting any material. So fortunately Kalanchoe actually takes some cuttings really easily. It's a plant that always wants to put out roots, and if any of the stems get damaged, you'll sometimes see roots starting to come from the lower stems anyway. It really doesn't take long for the cuttings to take root. They're very happy to do so, and because it's a succulent plant, the cuttings have much higher chance of succeeding. The reason being they don't dry out as quickly. The biggest risk for most cuttings is when you cut them off the plant, they're not receiving any water, and until they can regrow their new roots, they're going to slowly dry out and die. A normal plant will die within 2 or 3 days unless you keep it really humid and well protected, and it normally takes a week or two for most plants to grow roots. But with a Kalanchoe being succulent, there's a lot of water in the stems, a lot of water in the leaves, so it takes several weeks for it to dry out completely. So it nearly always manages to grow its roots before it dries out and then can survive. So success rate on Kalanchoe cuttings is very high, often close to 100%, especially if you do it correctly. So I'll go through the process now, show you how to take the cuttings and what kind of soil to plant them in and what kind of aftercare they need afterwards. So when it comes to Kalanchoe cuttings, you do want to make sure you're wearing gloves. The sap of Kalanchoe is a little bit toxic, so always make sure you're wearing gloves and wash any equipment after use. What you'll need is a pair of secateurs, or if it's very thin stems like these here, you could probably get away with scissors. And what you want to do is you want to select the younger stems. You can also do it with older stems, but the younger stems normally root just a little bit faster than the older stems. So you want to find a section of stem, ideally one that hasn't got any side shoots coming off from the edge. If it does have side shoots, you can just cut them off later, but it just makes it a bit easier if there aren't any side shoots. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to cut it off, but I want to cut it off just above a couple of leaves. The reason being, when I cut it off here, it will then resprout more nicely. It's not a big issue when it comes to taking the cutting itself, it's more just when your plant responds to the pruning, it looks nicer and it doesn't have a dead section. If you just cut it right above a couple of leaves, it will then have these two dormant shoots then that can grow and produce new growth. So I'm just going to cut it just above there. So now you've got your cutting, you want to just do a couple of extra bits of trimming on the cutting. What you want is similar to when you cut it previously. You want there to be a small bit of stem just next to the lowest two leaves. When the plant has been cut and you put it in the soil, what will happen is any hormones from the top of the plant will travel down, and at the lowest point is where the roots will tend to grow, but there's extra shoots and hormones towards the section where the nodes are, which are basically where the two leaves are. That's where new growth will appear. So you can just slightly help the chance of the plant rooting if you cut it off close to that section. What you don't want is to have a large section of clear stem, so you just want it to end just like that, just underneath a couple of leaves. So the next thing you want to do is, if there's any side shoots like this one has, ideally I would take them off. You don't really want too much greenery on the cutting, otherwise it will dry out just a little bit faster. Ideally just have one clear stem. I could actually make even more cuttings with these two if I wanted. And when it comes to cutting size, you're probably looking for about this length. Anywhere between about 5 to 10 centimeters is a good length, so about 2 to 4 inches, something like that. And then what you want to do is you want to have a nice clear stem, because you're going to have to bury the stem underground, and if it's buried underground and it has leaves on it, the leaves will rot off and start to die. So if they're very small leaves like this, you can just carefully peel them off. But ideally you want to use something sharp, just so you have a clean cut. If you don't have a clean cut, what can happen is there's more chance of rot and infection getting in. So you just want to go up the side, clear off all the lowest leaves. So once you've cleared off the lowest leaves, you should be left with something like this. Now you want to leave about 2 to 4 leaves at the top. My leaves are particularly small in this plant, so I've actually left about 4 of them. If your leaves are a bit bigger, you want to leave maybe just 1 or 2 leaves. Basically, if there's too many leaves, it'll dry out just a little bit faster. It's not such a big issue as it is with other cuttings, because the leaves are succulent, they hold water themselves. But you still don't want to have massive amounts of leaves, because you don't want the small root system to have to deal with so many leaves when it's a young plant. You want it to really put its energy into the roots and not have to worry about looking after its leaves. So once you've got a clear stem like that, you want to actually leave it for a couple of days, let the cuts dry out, put it somewhere cool, out of the way of the sunshine, just let it dry out, and what will happen is the cuts will heal over very slightly. The reason you want to do this is because otherwise you can get rot setting in. If you put them in wet compost with fresh cuts, it's very likely that they'll start to rot and die off. So what you want to do is leave it a couple of days, let it heal over. That way there's much more chance that the cutting will take. So the next stage is putting the cutting in the soil. Now you want to have a very free draining mix. What I've done is I've got multi-purpose compost and I put lots of perlite in it, which is these white bits in here. That's to aid drainage. You could also use grit as well, or you could use seed and cutting compost or a cacti or succulent compost. Basically it has to be well drained, otherwise this will rot off quite easily. So that's one of the most important things when it comes to this, is getting a good soil mix that's not going to be too wet. Just pure multi-purpose compost or peat or coir, it will be too wet, so you really need to add something to it just to make sure it's free draining. Then if you've got a quite loose compost, you can just push it in the ground like this, just being careful not to break it off. You want to bury pretty much the whole stem, just leaving a few leaves at the top. If you've got compost which is a bit firmer, or you've got quite a thin, delicate stem, you actually want to hold the cutting in place and then just carefully put the soil around it, because you don't want to damage the cutting or introduce any new cuts. So what you want to do with this now that it's in the soil is you want to just give it a little bit of water. You want the compost to be slightly damp. You certainly don't want the compost to be wet, because until its roots have grown it can't absorb any moisture, so the compost will stay wet for a long time, and being a succulent there's a real risk it could start to rot and die. So you want to put this in a bright location, very slightly damp soil. You want to keep it away from direct sunshine though, because until the roots establish it can't absorb any water, and so it will very quickly dry out if you put it in direct sunlight. But you don't want it in complete darkness either, because it does need that little bit of energy coming from some light source to help it to grow its roots. So ideally you would put it somewhere with bright indirect light, so next to a window but without the direct sunlight coming, so it's got bright light most of the day but doesn't get hit by direct sunlight at all. A little bit of direct sunlight first thing in the morning or last thing at night is no problem, but generally try and avoid it if you can. And then when it comes to watering, after that first initial water, just check it every few days. When you check it, try and see if it's still damp under the surface, because often the surface dries out faster and it might look dry but underneath it's still quite damp. And if you do check it, just be very careful not to disturb any of the roots. It can be a little bit tricky, that process. Sometimes what I do is I check the weight of the soil just by lifting it and seeing if it feels heavy or not. But it's always best to underwater these cuttings than overwater them. They are succulents, they can handle quite a while without water, so ideally you want to be a bit low in the watering side. After that initial watering, I wouldn't expect you'll need to water these for a week or two, as the compost will take a long time to dry out. So what you should notice after about 2 or 3 weeks is the compost starts to dry out a little bit faster, and also the plant will start to show signs of growth or some recovery if it has dried out slightly, and that's the sign that the roots have established. So you'll probably notice in the first week or two this plant will start looking worse and worse. The leaves will get thinner, maybe get slightly wrinkly, and it'll look like it's starting to die. And then what will happen is once the roots have started to grow and absorb water from the soil, you'll then see the leaves start to inflate again, become a bit thicker. The wrinkled appearance would start to disappear on the leaves, and you might start to notice some new growth coming from the middle. Once you start noticing growth coming from the new shoots on the plant, what you want to do is start watering like you would normally with a Kalanchoe, and just put it to a much sunnier location. Avoid midday sun because Kalanchoes don't like really bright sunshine, but give it really good light levels, some direct sunshine as well, just avoiding the strongest of sun, and it should start to grow for you quite nicely. What you can find sometimes though is with a new cutting, you can, the first few months you might get one long stem. It's quite a good idea after the plant has been growing for about a month or so, just to cut the plant in half. What that will do is it will coincide branching, and you'll get a nice bushy plant instead of a long leggy plant, because naturally Kalanchoes tend to like to grow a long thin stem before they start branching. But if you just cut that in half, you'll get branching from lower down, and you'll just get a nice kind of compact shrubby plant. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take multiple cuttings from my plant and cut this all back, get it a bit more compact so it looks a little bit nicer. I'm then going to show you guys the cuttings in a few weeks time as they're just starting to root and starting to grow, and then I'm going to put them into a flowering phase by having short days, and I'll show you how they can flower at really quite young size. Kalanchoes, they can kind of flower any size, just depends when you decide to give them that light phase to encourage them to come into flowering. Even the smallest of cuttings can actually come into flower. So what I'll do is I'll put them into that process, and you should notice in a few weeks time when I do the update that these plants will be starting to think about flowering already, even at the small size. So it's now about 2 months later, and as you can see the cuttings have done quite well and they're starting to come into flower. So I'll show you the small cuttings first. They're the ones down here, the ones that I showed in the previous section of the video. You can see here they've all got nice flower buds coming on them at slightly different stages, but they're all going to flower within a week or so of each other. So all I've done with these is I've taken the cuttings like I showed previously in the video, put them in that cutting medium. I had them on long daylight levels just to encourage them to have a little bit of growth, and that's why you can see they've grown a bit larger than when I first took the cutting. And then after about a month of growing with normal daylight levels, what I then did is I put them into a short daylight phase to encourage flowering, where I only had the lights on for 8 hours at a time and had darkness for 18 hours, and that's encouraged them to go into flower. So you can see all these young cuttings, even though they're really small and they're just tiny little plants, they're already getting lots of flower buds and they're going to put on a nice flowering display. It's just to show you that you can induce them into flowering at any time of year if you're able to control the length of daylight hours, and you can have them coming into flower at pretty much any size. So you can see, as I say, these are quite small plants and they're flowering, and the main mother plant at the top here is also just coming into flower. You can see all these buds starting to form. It's not looking at the best, that's because I had this under grow lights to give it that daylight treatment, and it was a bit close to the grow lights at first, so I did scorch some of the leaves, but it's looking quite good otherwise. Lots of flower buds coming. It's just to show that it doesn't matter what size the plant is, they will still flower if you give them that daylight treatment. The main factor for the flowering is really just making sure you get those short days and long nights, and the temperatures can also give it help slightly as well with lower temperatures at night time, but generally what you need is the daylight length. So what I'm going to do now is I'll put these under a time lapse, and I'll just leave you with that at the end of the video so you can see them coming into flower and fully flowering nicely.